Okay. So welcome. Thank you all for coming to today's program, When Crime Was Kosher. Jenny Chacon, the administrator for the church before, was telling me she had to laugh this morning when she saw the poster come across and use the term kosher nostra. I did not coin the term, so I will not claim authorship, but there's actually a book out called The Kosher Nostra. There's also another wonderful book about Jews and organized crime called But They Were Good to Their Mothers. And I highly recommend both of them. So, for most of our history, Jews have been seen as nice, law-abiding citizens. We are a people of the law. We are accustomed to obeying law, or doing our best to do so. And in fact, in New York in the 18th and 19th centuries, police officials would often remark that the Jewish population kept their neighborhoods quieter than almost any other district. In the 19th century, a newspaper, there we go, the Washington Sentinel, noted that that Jews were among our best citizens, and this ancient race, quote unquote, can boast that there are fewer paupers and fewer criminals among them than any other race can exhibit. Proof of the high moral standing of the Hebrews is that only 2 murderers have sprung up from their ranks in 250 years. Don't ask where they got that one from. But this all changed, you see. What they're referring to in the 19th century primarily are German Jews. German Jews who came here, as anybody know the term yekas? A yeka, it's a Yiddish word which refers to a German Jew. Why? Because German Jews, they were with their propriety and their discipline, always wore yekas, jackets. All right. And what did the Eastern European Jews wear? A sweater, a sweater or a vest. Okay. But when the waves of Eastern European immigrants came, they were much poorer than the German immigrants who had come over mid-19th century. And they arrived, most of them, only with what they could carry and a few kopecks in their pocket. And they were immediately thrust into neighborhoods such as the Lower East Side, where everyone around them was not much better off. And so the Jewish gangsters were the children of the ghettos of America, of New York and Chicago and Detroit, Philadelphia, Newark. And in truth, when the ghetto disappeared, the Jewish gangster sort of disappeared, at least from the streets. They're now on Wall Street. You can find them. They're arbitrageurs and hedge fund managers. Yes, Andy.
How about St. Louis? Was that part of it? Because I know part of my family was there and there were lots of stories.
I will say right up front, this class will not be long enough for me to cover every city. I'm not going to cover Los Angeles. I'm not going to talk about Philadelphia, which had their own Jewish mafiosi. We're going to focus primarily on New York, Chicago, Detroit, which was huge, and Baltimore because of my personal connection there. So we've all kind of forgotten the Jewish gangsters, because now we're in a generation where we don't need to turn to crime, most of us, to make it in America. But there's always this little bit of pride, I think, when you hear about Bugsy Siegel or Dutch Schultz or Meyer Lansky, the smart criminal, right? And so we get a little admiration, I think, when we utter those names that, it wasn't all Luciano and Mazzone and those guys, right? Capone. When the children of the gangsters went legit, they didn't all become doctors or lawyers, though. A lot of them moved to backroom casinos. They moved out to become casino managers and owners in Las Vegas and Atlantic City, and now worldwide, nationwide. But they did indeed have style, that's for sure. And in fact, racetracks all over America had and still have Jewish owners, and high stakes gaming and gambling by Jews and others goes on to this very, very day. But again, as I referred to not facetiously, we call them arbitrators and hedge fund managers. They still inhabit a world that validates the philosophy of Arnold Rothstein. He was a king of Jewish crime in the early 1920s, who famously said, the business of America is profit. And he was spot on. In fact, Rothstein is the first big macher in organized Jewish crime. And he also was probably the most unusual because Rothstein didn't fit the stereotypical up from the poverty of the ghetto model. Rothstein, Arnold the Brain, they called him, or Mr. Big, was a famous kingpin. He more than anybody else transformed crime on the Lower East Side and in Manhattan and in the other 5 boroughs of New York from a thuggish activity run by a bunch of hoodlums knocking over push carts and running protection rackets. He turned it into a big business, run like a corporation, with himself, of course, at the top. And he also showed the young hoodlums of the Lower East Side how to have style. And in fact, Lucky Luciano would later say that Rothstein is the man who taught him how to dress. He was born in New York. He was the son of a respectable Jewish businessman, Abraham Rothstein, grew up in a very comfortable home on the east side of Central Park. He was very skilled at mathematics as a child. And in fact, it was his favorite subject. And he hated all the other subjects in school and he dropped out at age 16. And meanwhile, his older brother, who was always his father's favorite, became a rabbi. So his father actually was a philanthropist, a noted philanthropist in New York. He was on the board of Beth Israel Hospital. But Arnold, by his own admission, didn't like school much. He would cut school, go downtown, play cards and dice, usually losing. But in his own words, it gradually dawned on me that if anybody's going to make money out of gambling, he'd better be on the right side of the fence. As a player, I was on the wrong side of the game. So by 1910, he's moved into the Tenderloin district of Manhattan, and he establishes a backroom gambling casino, a rather big one. And it was during this time that Rothstein's legendary pool playing marathon against a Philadelphia pool shark named Jack Conway, shipped in by Rothstein's enemies to humiliate him in a game, took place. And over 2 days and nights, in 1911, at McGraw's Billiard Parlor in Herald Square, which was owned by John McGraw, the famous manager and owner of the New York Giants, Rothstein just kept playing and betting and playing and betting until eventually Conway's backers had lost $10,000. And in fact, John McGraw, the owner, has to step in and shut down the game. He says, because he had the very heavy Brooklyn accent, John McGraw said, if I let you guys keep playing on, I'm going to have one of yous dead on my hands. So this, by the way, was the real life inspiration for the opening scene in The Hustler with Paul Newman and Jackie Gleason as Fast Eddie Felson and Minnesota Fats. This game is the inspiration, this Rothstein pool game. So Rothstein's patronage of floating crap games, by the way, if you're on Zoom, you're not going to be able to hear sound, I understand, for this little clip, so excuses given. And you may not hear it that well in here, but let's see what happens, because we don't, I found out today, really have the capability, we don't have the right cable to have the sound from a Zoom laptop run into the sound system. But I'm going to try it with a microphone and not to get too much. So because Rothstein was also the inspiration for another very noted gambler, if I can find it. Here we go. And that was Nathan Detroit. Nathan Detroit and Damon Runyon. Why are we getting, oh, okay, somebody at home. The Runyon story, The Idol of Miss Sarah Brown, is of course, the inspiration for the musical Guys and Dolls. And at one point in his career, Rothstein truly did hold court every day at Lindy's at Broadway and 49th, where he would take bets right on the corner from people and make book. And he did it every morning. Now, in the movie, of course, they talk about Mindy's Deli, but they're really talking about Arnold Rothstein at Lindy's. How many of you ever went to Lindy's when it was in existence? Actually, there's a restaurant still holding that name. So anyhow, so when I got turned on to this, I just realized just how much fun this was going to be. Now let's see if this will work.
By the way, my St. Louis relatives are from this.
From the same family? Can we hear?
Yes.
So it just cracks me up that this scene was inspired by Arnold Rothstein hanging out in the barber shops and the restaurants in Times Square. Guys and Dolls, 1955 musical.
I'll arrange that you go broken, quiet, and peace. In the hideout provided by name, where there are no neighbors to scorn. It's the oldest and last anymore will die from shame. It's the oldest and last.
So just something for a little fun. Let me get back now and bring back PowerPoint. And away we go.
Probably inspiration for Frank later on in life.
I'm sorry, for inspiration for?
Frank Sinatra later on.
Oh, well, that's a whole other story, which we're actually going to talk about. We'll talk about Meyer Lansky. Because that's a real story where Frank Sinatra goes to Havana to appear in 1948 at a mafia meeting, carrying a suitcase full of money for the Rosado brothers from Sam Giancana, who is the owner and operator of the Capri Hotel and Casino in Havana. And that building is still there, as is the casino. It's not a casino anymore. It's just a show theater. But I used to stay in that hotel all the time when I went to Havana. And in fact, one year I finally graduated and they gave me Sam Giancana's suite on the top floor, which was really pretty cool.
Did it have bulletproof glass?
No, but it was up on the 18th floor, so I don't think we had to worry too much about any, maybe. But actually, now that you say that, they probably could have hit Giancana's window from across the street at the Nacional. So somebody up on the roof of the Nacional may have been able to take him out. All right, so anyhow, as Prohibition began, Rothstein purchased holdings in a bunch of speakeasies in New York. He also invests in a horse racing track in Havre de Grace, Maryland. And he fixed a lot of those races in Havre de Grace. And by the time he was 30, he supposedly was already a millionaire, which in 1919 was a lot of money. So most famously in 1919, Rothstein's agent allegedly paid members of the Chicago White Sox to throw the World Series that year, enabling him to make a significant sum betting against Chicago in what came to be known as the Black Sox scandal. And it really changed baseball forever because it led to the appointment of a commissioner, Judge Kennesaw Mountain Landis, who was seen as tough on crime and would clean up baseball. So there were Rothstein's notoriety actually led to a number of characters besides Nathan Detroit. Author F. Scott Fitzgerald. He used Rothstein as the inspiration for Jay Gatsby's crooked associate Meyer Wolfsheim. At one point, Gatsby says to Nick Carraway, the narrator, That's the man who fixed the 1919 World Series. So Arnold Rothstein has made a big cultural impact in America. Unfortunately, he was into more than just gambling. He diversified into bootlegging, into narcotics, and he brought along such underworld luminaries as Lansky, Jack Legs Diamond, Charles Lucky Luciano, and Dutch Schultz. And Rothstein frequently mediated differences between these New York sub-gangs for a very hefty fee to keep peace. And he used that same big business acumen that brought him to the top of gambling and bootlegging to the narcotics trade, unfortunately. You like to think that, oh, the Jews weren't involved in the narcotics trade. Not true. Rothstein sent dope buyers to the Far East in Europe. In 1923, a kilo of heroin would cost about $2,000. By the time Rothstein got done distributing it, it sold for more than $300,000. It was a very tidy little business. And by 1926, reportedly, he was the king of narcotics in the United States. But after Rothstein dies, he's rubbed out by a rival to whom he owed a large gambling debt in 1927. His interest in bootlegging and gambling went to his Jewish friends, Meyer Lansky and Ben Bugsy Siegel. Arthur Dutch Schultz got a cut, as did Waxy Gordon. The narcotics he actually gave to the Italian mob to keep peace with the Jewish mob so they'd each have their own business and they wouldn't go to war together, which worked for a long, long time. Now, Waxy Gordon, interesting character. Waxy's real name was Irving Wexler. He was nicknamed Waxy because as a youthful pickpocket, he was able to slide a victim's wallet out so smoothly, it was like it was coated in wax. And that's why they called him Waxy. He made his bones as a labor goon, strike breaker, and he would actually work for both sides. Sometimes he worked for management, other times he worked for the unions. And when Prohibition went into effect, he saw the potential for the money, and he approached Rothstein for financial backing. And he already worked for a freelance muscle, and Rothstein bankrolled him and kept him as a counter to the Lansky Luciano group. So Rothstein was always playing all the angles. That's why they called him Mr. Big. He had a big picture of what was going on, not just in New York rackets, but also all over the Midwest, Chicago, St. Louis, Detroit. By the 1920s, Waxy was worth over $2 million. He owned speakeasies, nightclubs, casinos. He had a fleet of ocean-going rum ships, and he owned blocks of real estate in Philadelphia and in New York. He lived in Scarsdale in a castle complete with a moat. And he also had a luxurious 10-room apartment up on the Upper East Side. In 1952, he died in Alcatraz of a massive heart attack. He was 66 years old, facing new federal drug charges, and that kind of did him in. Another Rothstein protege was Dutch Schultz, Arthur Fliegenheimer. He also starts out as a street teen hoodlum, robbing craps games before he ultimately turns to burglary. Eventually, he's caught breaking into an apartment. He gets sent to prison on Roosevelt Island. And he was such an unmanageable prisoner that he was transferred to a work farm in Long Island. And he was recaptured, he escaped, he got captured again, and had more time added to his sentence. Finally, in 1920, he's released on parole, and he begins working for a liquor and trucking firm, smuggling liquor and beer into New York City from Canada. And that's when he became known as Deutsch Schultz, instead of Arthur Fliegenheimer. As somebody who doesn't go by his birth name, I understand the attraction. So anyhow, so in the 1920s, he starts to work as a bouncer in a place called the Hub Social Club in the Bronx. And it's owned by a gangster named Joey No. And No was impressed by Schultz's ruthlessness. He makes him a partner. And pretty soon they're eliminating, with guns and muscle, rival gangs. And soon they were the only gang operating in the Bronx. And they got big enough, they were able to rival the five Italian families of New York. They originally worked only up in the Upper West Side, Washington Heights, but then they moved into New York, into Yorkville and Harlem. Their headquarters moved from the Bronx to East 149th Street in Manhattan. And this brazen move of moving into Manhattan led to a war with no one other than New York's Irish mob, led by Jack Legs Diamond. And in the early hours of October 16, Dutch's partner, Joey No, is shot to death outside the Chateau Madrid, which was a legitimate club in the 40s. In the 20s, it was a speakeasy over on West 54th. And then a few weeks later, the war started. 1928. Rothstein is murdered, and all hell breaks loose between the gangs. Schultz orders the death of Legs Diamond in an attempt to consolidate his control of the rackets in New York. But Prohibition soon, in the 30s, before this war is over, ended. And when Prohibition ends, Dutch Schultz needs to find new sources of income. His chance came with one man named Abadaba Berman, Otto Abadaba Berman, who ran the Harlem Numbers racket. He was just a middle-aged accountant. That was his origin, right? But he was a math whiz, and he helped Schultz fix the rackets because Berman, in a matter of seconds, could calculate the minimum amount of money that Schultz would need to bet at a track in order to alter the odds in his favor. And this strategy ensured that Schultz always controlled which numbers would win. Everybody understands the numbers game? New? You basically take the winners from select numbers of races, and those numbers, like a lottery ticket, become the number. They distill them down. But those numbers change depending on the odds of the races. It's not based on who wins, it's based on the payout. So by changing the payout, you change the number. And he would make sure that he changed the number. If somebody was bidding heavily on one number, he would go and bet heavily on a race, change the odds, change the number to make sure he didn't lose all too much money if that number was the one that came in at the end of the day. Berman was paid by Schultz about $10,000 a week. Today, that'd be about $143,000 a week. And he also got into the restaurant protection racket in New York. But soon, New York's crusading district attorney, Thomas E. Dewey, found Berman's weak spot and charged him with tax evasion. So Schultz lost Berman, lost his brain, and his rackets at the same time were being threatened by the Lucky and Meyer and Bugs gang, Luciano, Siegel, and Meyer Lansky. And in an attempt to avert his conviction on tax charges, Schultz asked the commission, which was the mob council at that time, for permission to assassinate Thomas Dewey. They said no, you can't. Schultz tried anyway. And he attempted to kill Dewey. He failed, and the commission had him murdered in 1935. They got rid of Dutch Schultz. Shortly before his death, though, fearing he'd be incarcerated by Dewey, he had built for himself, according to legend, a special airtight, waterproof safe. Into it, he placed $7 million in cash and bonds. And with his partner, Gussie Rosencrantz, he drove upstate New York. He buries the safe. At the time of his death, that safe was still interred. There was no evidence to indicate that either Schultz or Rosencrantz had ever revealed the location of this safe to anyone. And the exact place where it was buried is a mystery. It died with both men, but there are still to this day people digging around in Sullivan County trying to find this safe. Sullivan County is, of course, Monticello and the Catskills. Rumors circulated actually that other crime bosses, such as Luciano, spent much of their lives sending out men to go digging for this safe. Never been recovered. Now, of course, the greatest, the most admirable, I'll put that in big quotes, admirable of the Jewish gangsters is probably Meyer Lansky, because, well, Meyer was, a criminal, a math genius, but he was a tireless supporter of the state of Israel. And he spent a vast amount of money running guns to Israel in 47 and 48 during the War of Independence. He was a big contributor to the Jewish National Fund. In fact, that got him eventually in trouble. So Lansky developed a gambling empire that stretched from Saratoga, New York, all the way to Miami and to Las Vegas and to Cuba. Massive gambling empire. Gambling was his thing. And although he was a member of the Jewish mafia, he had very strong alliances with the Italian mafia, played a large role in the consolidation of the underworld and the building of what would come to be known as the syndicate. In the Italian, the Cosa Nostra. But the Jewish gangsters also were in alliance with the Cosa Nostra, at least into the 1960s. So Lansky, born Meyer Suchomlansky into a Jewish family in Grodno, which is now part of Belarus. And he got married to a woman there who came with him to America, his wife, Yetta, his wife for the rest of his life. He met Bugsy Siegel when they were both teenagers on the Lower East Side. And they became friends with their buddy from 2 streets over in Little Italy, Charles Luciano. So they formed a lasting partnership. Lansky was instrumental in Luciano's rise to power because he's the one who actually organized and ordered the hit in 1931 of Salvatore Maranzano, who was the mafia kingpin at that point in New York. And as a youngster, Siegel saved Lansky's life many times, which Lansky always appreciated. So the two of them formed the Bugs Meyer mob, which worked more behind the scenes initially than out front, except in gambling. Meyer discovered the Caribbean for the Northeastern crime syndicate, and they invested their illegal profits they made in the state into an assortment of lucrative gambling ventures in Cuba. He was also reportedly responsible for the mafia's decision to declare Miami a free city, that no single family would control the rackets in Miami. Not the usual rules of territorial monopoly, which are the way that the gangsters worked in most places. You have a question? Okay. So let's take you to Chicago for a minute. 1931, Al Capone is convicted of tax evasion and prostitution, and Lansky realizes that he's also vulnerable to the same type of prosecution by a zealous district attorney. So he transfers all of his illegal holdings in the United States into a Swiss numbered bank account. And the anonymity of this was protected by the 1934 Swiss Banking Act. So eventually he actually bought himself an offshore bank, and he began laundering money through a network of shell and holding companies. At the time in 1930s, this was a new innovation. Now everybody does it who has real wealth they want to protect from taxes. Offshore banking. But for Lansky was the innovator. He actually bought himself his own bank, and he ran it out of the Dominican Republic. So, but he's also, as I said, you get mixed feelings about Lansky's because during the 1930s, he and his gang were responsible for breaking up that rally at Madison Square Garden of the German-American Bund, the Nazi Party. He and his Italian Confederates, made sure that the docks were protected from Nazis, from saboteurs, from those who would, undermine the United States, from spies. Lansky was a patriot. He personally participated in a rally in Yorkville that he and 14 of his associated German-American Bund rally, Yorkville section of Manhattan, if you don't know, is very German. That was its origin. And the German-American Bund was quite strong in Yorkville. And he and 14 of his associates beat up dozens of Nazis that night. I mean, bloodied them. And the police just stood by and watched. Lansky paid everybody off. So it was one of those things that really undermined the American Nazi Party's influence in the Northeast because they were frightened of the Italian and the Jewish gangsters. So according to Lansky's authorized biography, at this time, he also arranged a deal with the US government via a high-ranking naval official that they would release Lucky Luciano from prison, where he was at that time, I think he was in Leavenworth. And in exchange, the Italian mafia would provide security for the warships along the New York docks. And after World War II, indeed, Lucky was paroled on the condition he returned permanently to Sicily. However, he secretly moves to Cuba, where he worked to resume control over his American mafia operations. And with that, Lansky organized that famous 1958 Mafia Summit in Havana, which is depicted in Godfather 2. Let us take a quick look at that scene, if I can make it work. It's here. Let's find out. We got it. I got to do a bunch of stuff. I got to do that. Got to do that. Got to move that. That. No, and that. Okay, and get rid of that. We might get an ad. I hope not. Let's see what happens. I hope you can hear me.
Very pleased. You're all able to come from such distances to be with me.
This, of course, is Lee Strasberg playing Meyer, playing Meyer Lansky late in
Point of his life,
1958.
he wants to turn over the things he's been blessed with. Turn them over to friends.
Of course, Mario Puzo claims that he did base Hyman Roth, this
And to
character,
make sure,
both in the book and in the film, on Lansky, but also he based some aspects of Michael Corleone's character on Lansky.
yeah, we'll see. The doctors would disagree, but what do they know? These are wonderful things that we've achieved in Havana, and there's no limit to where we can go from here. This kind of government knows how to help business, will encourage it. The hotels here are bigger and swankier than any of the rough joints we put in Vegas. And we can thank our friends in the Cuban government, which has put up half of the cash with the Teamsters on a dollar-for-dollar basis, has relaxed restrictions on imports. What I'm saying is that we have now what we have always needed, real partnership with the government. Smaller piece. You all know Michael Corleone, and we all remember his father. At the time of my retirement or death, I turn over all my interest in the Havana operation to his control. But all of you will share. The Nacional will go to the Lakeville Road boys. The Capri to the Corleone family. The Sevilla
Again,
Milk
Capri,
Board also.
that's the hotel I was talking about
Eddie
before.
Levine of Newport will bring in the Benino brothers, Dino and Eddie, for a piece and also to handle the actual casino operations. And we've saved a piece for some friends in Nevada to make sure that things go smooth back home. I want all of you to enjoy your cake. So, enjoy.
Does that sound Jewish or what? Enjoy it.
So an interesting thing happened. A rebel was being arrested by the military police. And rather than be taken alive, he exploded a grenade he had hidden in his jacket. Killed himself, and he took a captain of the command with him. Right, gentlemen? Rebels, no, they're lunatics. Maybe so. But it occurred to me, the soldiers are paid to fight. The rebels aren't.
What does that tell you?
They can win.
This country has had rebels for the last 50 years. Since that blood, believe me, I know. I've been coming here since the 20s. We were running molasses out of Havana when you were a baby. The trucks owned by your father. Michael. Rather, we talked about this when we were alone. 2 million never got to the island. I wouldn't want it to get around that you held back the money because you had second thoughts about the rebels. but I wouldn't give for 20 more years. Here we are, protected, free to make our profits without keep up with the goddamn Justice Department and the FBI. 90 miles away, partnership with a friendly government. 90 miles. No. One small step, looking for a man that wants to be president of the United States, having the cash to make it possible. Michael? We're bigger than U.S. Steel.
Lansky actually said that to his wife. So that's a real quote that was lifted directly and put into the Godfather book and film. He said to his wife one day, "Yetta, we're bigger than U.S. Steel." So I mentioned, of course, I said the Rosado brothers, but it wasn't. It was the Fassetti brothers that came with Sinatra with the suitcase of money. That act by Sinatra and the Fassetti brothers dogged Sinatra the rest of his career. That people thought that he had mafia connections. I mean, he was friends with all those guys from Newark. Don't get me wrong; he grew up with them, but there were rumors that he was actually one of the Dons and in control. I heard all kinds of stuff over the years. Lansky, anyhow, at one point would run the Deauville, the Montmartre, and the Hotel Nacional casinos, and ultimately would build his own dream palace, known as, and it's still there in Cuba, I've been there, called the Riviera. And I mentioned the Capri Hotel. The Riviera is twice as big. In the 1950s, it was 58 it opened. It was twice as swanky. And the American mafia thought that they were going to be on a roll for a long time to come. But as Michael Corleone highlights for us in the film, the problem was going to be the rebels. And in 59, there's the Cuban Revolution. Fidel Castro changes the climate for the mob in Cuba. In fact, Lansky fled Havana the day before Castro drove in at the head of a column of tanks. And in October of 1960, Castro nationalized all the hotels and all the casinos. And this wiped out Lansky's asset base. It took away his revenue streams. He lost an estimated $7 million in 1960. And he was forced to rely on his Las Vegas revenues. Now, in his later years, he lived a very low-profile, routine existence in Miami Beach, and he made life very difficult for the FBI. He was so elusive that by the 1970s, they had given up on trying to nail Lansky. The special task force that had existed since the Kefauver Commission in the 50s disbanded within the Justice Department. But Lansky didn't know it. He thinks he's about to get arrested, flees to Israel, and he changes claims under the law of return his Israeli citizenship. And that's when the U.S. suddenly stood up and said, no, extradite him back here, even though they had nothing to charge him with. 2 years later, Israel did deport Lansky. Some of you may remember this. It was quite prevalent in the news. But the government's case was so weak that he was acquitted in 1974. So he was never acquitted of a crime. He spent his last years quietly at home in Miami Beach. He died in 1983, at the age of 81, left behind a widow and 3 kids. What's interesting about Lansky is on paper, he was worth almost nothing. He had a little bungalow on Southwest 81st Court in Miami Beach. And at the time, though, the FBI believed that he had over 300 million hidden in offshore bank accounts and other assets, they never found a dime. That's how sharp Lansky was. And in fact, in 1982, right before, was it right before he died? Right before he died, Forbes listed him as one of the 400 wealthiest people in America, listing his assets at over $100 million, which in 1982 was a lot of money. So, the character in our clip, Hyman Roth, was portrayed by Lee Strasberg, the great method actor and teacher of method actors. In fact, he got an Academy Award nomination for that role. After the premiere in 1974, Lansky actually called Lee Strasberg, congratulated him on a good performance, but he added, "You could have made me more sympathetic." And so moving on, let me play the second clip. There's one more clip here. I just want to, it mixes things up. It means we don't have to be a talking head all day. So here's another clip from The Godfather, which important, and we're going to talk about Mo Green in a minute.
Voy a hacer una petición que nos están llamando. Flying in from Miami.
Can you hear this?
Yes.
Makes sense, tells me your brother paid on going back for money. Where is it? Pulling out. Wow. What? How do you feel? I don't know. It's 4 million just to be able to take a piss without it hurting. Who had Frank Fantastic? The Rosado brothers. I know. Who gave the go ahead? No, I didn't. This kid, I grew up with younger than me. Looked up to you. Did our first work together. Worked our way out of the street. Things were good. We made the most of it. During Prohibition, ran molasses into Canada. Paid a fortune. Your father. As much as anyone, I loved him and trusted him. Later on, we had an idea. Build a city out of a desert stubble for GIs on the way to the West. That kid's name was Mo Green. And the city he invented was Las Vegas. Great man. And a vision of guts. And there isn't even a plaque or a signpost or a statue of him in that town. Someone put a bullet through his arm. No one knows who gave the order. I heard it, wasn't angry. You know, I knew he was headstrong, talking loud, saying stupid things. So it turned up dead. Let it go. I said to myself, this is the business we've chosen. I didn't ask who gave the order, because it had nothing to do with business. Then I get the wrong. Going in, taking out my place. On the table, so now I have a father.
So, back to Meyer Lansky. Of course, Mo Green is Bugsy Siegel. And what can I say? Bugsy, oops, didn't do that, sorry. Let me go back to Zoom. So many moving parts in this thing. Let's, yeah, here we go. Let's do that. Got it. Bugsy Siegel, Benjamin Hyman Siegel, was born in Williamsburg, Brooklyn. His mom and dad were from Letichiv, which is in the Podolia region of the Russian Empire, modern-day Ukraine. They was one of 5 children. They lived in a small tenement apartment in Brooklyn. By the time he's a late teenager, 16, 17 years old, his main source of income is from running crap games in the street. Joins a gang in the Lower East Side of New York and Lafayette Street, and they committed thefts, pushcart protection, things like that, until he hooked up with a guy named Mo Sedway. They devised this pushcart protection racket where merchants were forced to pay him $1 a week. Otherwise, they would throw kerosene on their stuff running by and torch their whole pushcart. But that's as far as his criminal activities went until he met Meyer Lansky. He was fighting some kid over a handgun one day when Lansky grabbed him and hurried him away because the cops were coming and he was going to get arrested. And so because Lansky saved Siegel, they become lifelong friends. So they start their own gang, which at the time was known as the Bugs Meyer Gang, because at that time, Benny, who didn't like the name Bugsy, but everybody called him Bugsy because he was thought to be crazier than a bed bug. They started out, the two of them, with a string of burglaries. They fenced the things they stole. They formed this small gang, and their activities expanded to gambling, to car theft. Siegel was the muscle. He was the hitman for this gang, and Lansky would hire Siegel out to other crime families for a hit because of Lansky's connections with the Italians. By the age of 21, Bugsy's making pretty good money. He bought a fancy apartment at the Waldorf Hotel. He wore fancy clothes. He bought a Tudor house up in Scarsdale. And in 1930, Lansky and Siegel began to build their alliance with Lucky Luciano and Frank Costello, the future bosses of the Genovese crime family. And Siegel also becomes associated with Albert the Mad Hatter Anastasia. And Siegel and Anastasia, along with Vito Genovese, whom Vito Corleone is based on, by the way, and a guy named Joe Adonis, they were the 4 gunmen who shot down the Italian crime boss Joe Masseria on Luciano's orders in 1931. That formally ended an ongoing gang war called the Castellamarese Wars in Brooklyn. But on September 10, that same year, Bugs and Meyer, they hire a gunman to murder Masseria's rival, Salvatore Maranzano, and that cemented Lucky Luciano's rise to the top of the Italian 5 families by Meyer and Bugs orchestrating the deaths of Luciano's biggest rivals. So that's the American Organized Crime Alliance of the 5 families that really continues to this very day. It's quiet. You know, we think, oh, crime families, it must be like, you know, the Sopranos, like you see on the TV. And yes, indeed, trash hauling, waste removal is a big mafia controlled business. Ask anybody who owns a business in New York what you got to do on this, you know, where's the bakshish you got to pay to the grease to make sure your trash gets picked up and it's not left stinking on the sidewalk of your restaurant or your business. So Bugsy decides though that there's enough blood and the police are going to come after him. So he decides to pick up his wife, his family. They move out to LA and he takes over the rackets in LA. He controls bookmaking, prostitution, and ultimately narcotics with his lieutenant, one Mickey Cohen. So also, by the way, ironically, Bugsy met a friend from the old neighborhood when he was in LA. His name was George Raft. And you might remember George Raft, who always played a gangster, not always, but usually played a gangster, right? Flipping the coin. That was the stereotype of George Raft. So Raft introduces Benny to Hollywood stars, to Hollywood royalty, and starts, he starts palling around with people. He gets to know Jean Harlow and Clark Gable, and he had his own influence in Hollywood because he had control of a union that represented all the extras that worked at all the studios. Bugsy controlled that. And he frequently would call them out on strike to win concessions. And in one case, to get a starring role, a semi-starring role for his girlfriend, Virginia Hill. Basically, if you give, he told Louis Mayer, you give Virginia this role in this film or nobody works. Louis gave in, gave her the job. So Virginia too was a petty hoodlum herself. And so she and Benny started a number of joint ventures, prostitution, some gambling, some drug smuggling. But by 41, he needs to get away even from the charges against him now by the Los Angeles police. So he goes with his friend Mo Sedway from New York to Las Vegas, where gambling, of course, is legal. And most of the casinos had wire services that reported the daily horse races, as I described earlier. And Bugs and Sedway immediately muscled everybody out and got control of the wire services. So within a matter of months, Bugsy and Mo are controlling all the wire services, all the sports books in LA, and the numbers in LA. I'm sorry, in Las Vegas. But his real dream was to build a luxurious hotel and a high-class casino better than anything that they had in Havana. And he persuades the crime bosses to invest in a lavish new project called the Flamingo. The Flamingo Hotel. This was the first Flamingo Hotel built by Bugsy Siegel. It later becomes much larger and more grandiose, but this is how it was on opening night. After large delays, cost overruns, because Benny decides that they need a swimming pool that would be unlike anything ever seen, and he has a swimming pool put in with one wall is completely glass, so you can see all the swimmers from the neck down, which he thought was hysterical. People didn't like it so much. Anyhow, but after all these cost overruns, the pool, the redesigns, the Flamingo is still not open. And to discuss the problem, the Bugsy Flamingo problem, their mafia investors had a secret meeting in Havana. This was 46, 12 years before the commission meeting that we saw in the movie clip before. While the other bosses all wanted to kill Siegel, Lansky begged them to give Bugsy another chance. And despite his reprieve, he continues to lose money at the Flamingo. So they had a second meeting of the investor mafiosi families. And by then, actually, this casino was starting to turn a small profit. And Lansky, again, with the support of Lucky Luciano, convinces the other families to give Benny more time. But soon the Flamingo's losing money again. There's a third meeting. They declared that Siegel's finished. It's widely believed that Lansky himself had to give the final okay on the hit because of his long relationship with Siegel and his stature in the family. Bugsy's murder was never solved. So, during Prohibition, and picture of Mickey Cohen, who when Bugsy dies, he takes over the LA rackets. There's a movie called, from the 1980s, called Mobster, with Harvey Keitel playing Mickey Cohen. Not a great movie, but Keitel does a good job with, as he does always, does a good job with the character. So let's shift a little bit from outright organized crime to crime in plain sight. Let's talk a little bit about the Bronfman brothers. So during Prohibition, Jewish gangsters are major operatives in the American underworld, prominent control in the creation and the organization of crime in the United States. One of the great ironies, of course, of Prohibition is that instead of creating the perfect society, the dry society, by banning the consumption of liquor, that era produced one of the most violent, crime-ridden periods in American history. And Detroit was the first major U.S. city, even ahead of the Volstead Act, a full year ahead of the Volstead Act, which is 1919. In 1918, Detroit declared itself a dry city. So they had a one-year lead on Prohibition in the rest of the country. So that year was a chance for gangsters in Detroit to build a network transferring booze from across the lake, across the Detroit River in Windsor, Ontario, to the United States. The Jewish Navy, it was called. So Detroit was a smuggler's paradise. There were 28 miles of the Detroit River coastline. It was less than a mile across in some areas, thousands of coves and hiding places. And along with Lake Erie, Lake St. Clair, and the St. Clair River, these waterways carried an incredible 75% of all the liquor that came to the United States during Prohibition. We always think rum runners coming off the coasts. It was coming over from Canada. It was a match made in heaven, right? Detroit gave way to thirsty Americans a year ahead of the rest of the country, a chance to build your business, get it ready for the explosion that would take place when the rest of the country goes dry. And they're legally able to produce alcoholic beverages, beer and whiskey in Canada in large quantities. And most of the alcohol comes from Seagram's Distillers, owned by the Bronfman brothers. Their entry into the liquor business actually comes indirectly. They were hotel keepers. And in the early 1900s, using money they had earned as horse traders, Samuel Bronfman and his brothers Abe, Harry, and Alan bought several hotels along Lake Erie and Lake Ontario. Each hotel had its own bar, and they discovered pretty quickly that the real money was not made renting the rooms. It was really made in the hospitality business. So they began to buy small distilleries to supply their hotels. Now that changes in 1915 when the temperance movement that's spreading across Canada as well as the United States bars the sale of alcohol in the prairie provinces. And the Bronfmans almost went out of business. Their hotels, the ones that were in Alberta, Saskatchewan, began to close because they couldn't stay open without the alcohol business. But there were gaping loopholes in the law, including one that allowed the sale of liquor from one province of Canada to another. So you couldn't consume it in Alberta, but I could sell you liquor from Ontario to Alberta, and you could then serve it privately in speakeasies. So Versatile Bronfman and his brothers, they decide to go into a mail order business, and they're shipping vast quantities of alcohol by rail, legally, into the next province. Just nobody knows where it's going after it gets there. But it was also legal to sell alcohol as medicine. So the Bronfmans incorporate as a drug company. And some of their product has names on it like Rockabye Cough Cure or Liver and Kidney Cure. So once Prohibition comes into effect in 1919 in the United States, all the cities who were not dry, remember the majority of Americans did not support Prohibition, were constantly looking for product, and the Bronfmans had it. So they set up shop in Montreal, and that's the liquor supply capital of Canada. And they built this distillery, Joseph E. Seagram and Sons Distillery, outside of Montreal in 1924. But Sam, the brother Sam Bronfman, he's not satisfied with one distillery. He wants to make the best whiskey in the world. He's driven by quality and ego. And so he forms a partnership that exists to this day with Scotland Distillers Company Limited, which was already the world's biggest whiskey conglomerate. And then he purchased the already prestigious Seagram's and Sons Distillery. And using this new name, Joseph E. Seagram and Son, this becomes a legitimate face of American business to this very day, founded by Jewish bootleggers. And one of their biggest customers, by the way, partners, silent partners, Joe Kennedy, who got them the connections they needed to get the Scotch whiskey over to Canada and then smuggle it into the United States. So it was quite remarkable. In Detroit in particular, there was this very unique phenomenon of Jewish distillers in Canada selling to Jewish gangsters in Detroit. It was like, oh, Lonsman, I'll give you a little bit, a bissel of the business. And this is where the notorious Purple Gang came from. The Purples, and I'm not talking about Elvis Presley, the Purple Gang from Jailhouse Rock. I'm talking about the Purple Gang. They were children of Jewish immigrants. They worked hard to scrape out an honest living for themselves and their families in the Jewish Quarter near the Eastern Market on Detroit's Lower East Side. And they quickly graduated from nuisance crime to armed robbery, hijacking, extortion. They were notorious for very high-profile murders and their savagery in dealing with enemies. Everybody in Detroit was afraid of the Purple Gang, these nice Jewish boys. They soon came to dominate the liquor business in the Midwest, and they soon rivaled and eventually made peace with Al Capone's syndicate in Chicago. Rather than go to war, Capone and the Purples made an alliance. And so the entire Midwest was under their control for the distribution of liquor.
Could you go back for a minute?
Yes.
Do you know what the numbers are that are below the people? There are numbers there. Or above, I'm sorry.
Above, I don't, wait a minute, was that there? No.
You had that. Yes,
Oh, these?
yes.
I'm not certain, but looking at them, they might be numbers that were signed in prison. Perhaps. It's a good question. I don't have the answer, but each of them has this number over their names or under their names. And again, it wouldn't shock. I mean, could this be a police lineup shot? Probably. Each of them might have been booked after this group shot, and their numbers may have been written onto the above their names. It's a date. 25710, 21471, 14498,
31561.
32561. Okay, so I don't think they're dates. I would believe they're probably prison numbers that a convict would be assigned rather than by their name. You dehumanize them by making them have a number. So here you see Sam Bernstein, his brother Joe Bernstein, along with Lou Gillerman and others. They formed the Purple Gang. They had a few Irish and Italian members in the gang, and they were too big to continue with small-time crime, so they branched out into other illegal activities such as gambling and prostitution and union racketeering. And because they got involved in union racketeering, they took control of cleaners and dyers operations. And this led to something called the Cleaners and Dyers War, which is very famous in Detroit history. It was murder, mayhem on the streets, bombings of dry cleaning shops and dry cleaning factories. And it didn't end until 9 members of the Purple Gang were arrested and went to trial for their activities. They were all actually acquitted, and maybe this is that photo, I can't say for certain. And that led to a bigger Detroit mob war once they got out of prison. And they were so feared that Al Capone thought it was more prudent to make the Purples his liquor agents to ship booze to Chicago rather than go to war with the gang. One of these shipments was hijacked by a Chicago criminal named Bugs Moran, which led to the St. Valentine Day Massacre of 1929. That was Purple's liquor that was being hijacked while it was being shipped into Ohio. So by 1929, illegal liquor was the second biggest business in Detroit, second only to the auto industry. And there was no mayor of Detroit who could get elected without playing ball with the Purple Gang. In fact, in 1933, state police raided a restaurant called the Deutsches Haus in Hamtramck, Michigan, and they arrested the mayor, John Smith, Michigan Congressman Robert Clancy, and Sheriff Edward Stein, all who were there drinking. But this alliance actually made the Purples arrogant, sloppy, to the point where they were terrorizing Detroiters with street crime. and executions of their enemies. And so soon, government agents, Michigan State Police, enlisted the help of the Italian mafia, who would soon trade places with the Purples and control the criminal underworld in Detroit. Then there's the other New York Jewish syndicate. I'm going to pick this up a little bit. And that was Murder Incorporated. Murder Incorporated, run by Louis Buchalter, known as Lepke to his mother, or Lepke. He was one of the premier labor racketeers in New York City. To date, Buchalter is the only American mob boss to have received the death penalty after being convicted of murder. He was born in the Lower East Side of Manhattan, 1897. His father owned a hardware store in the Lower East Side. He had one sister, three brothers. One brother becomes a dentist, another a college professor, one becomes a rabbi. So nice family, but Lepke was a bad egg. Because when he was 12 years old, in 1909, his father dies. In 1910, he finishes elementary school and decides he's done. He gets a job selling theatrical goods. And at night, he went to the Rabbi Jacob Joseph School of Lower East Side, where he was an honor roll student. But soon after, his mother moved to Arizona for health reasons, taking the boys with her, and left Louis in charge of his sister, Sarah. So Buchalter was in and out of prison, trying to make ends meet to take care of himself and his sister. He was arrested 3 times between 1915 and 1922. When he gets out of prison in 1922, he starts working with a friend of his, Norman Gura Shapiro. Oops, that's not Gura. Where's Gura? It's not Gura. Oh, anyhow, Buchalter and Gura, who had a real gravelly voice. Anyway, talking like Gura, like Gura. So that was Gura Shapiro. He was my grandmother's second cousin. And that's where our family connection will come in a minute. So Buchalter controlled the unions in New York. They were profitable for him. He forms an alliance with Tommy Lucchese, the leader of the Lucchese crime family. And together they controlled the whole garment district. All the unions, all the shops that are unionized in this era of unionization. They, by the way, also were active synagogue goers at Union Temple and Kol Israel Synagogue in Brooklyn. And their names for many years were on those little plaques, those dedication plaques for seats in the sanctuary. Synagogue's gone now. So Buchalter was a kind of quiet guy. He preferred listening over talking. He generously compensated his gangsters, his workers. He actually gave them perks. He gave them vacations, tickets to the hockey game, even winter cruises. So he gave them incentives to stay loyal besides money. In the early 1930s, Buchalter creates an effective process for performing contract killings for the Italian mob, for the Cosa Nostra. The press gave it the name Murder Incorporated because the goal was to keep the Italian mobsters disconnected from their hits. Instead, Buchalter and the Jewish mafia, through Albert Anastasia, he would relay a contract request from the Cosa Nostra to Buchalter, who would then assign the job to lower-ranking gangsters. None of these contract killers ever had any connection with any of the major crime families, and if they were caught, they could not implicate the bosses. They could not implicate the 5 families. So he used the same killers for his own murder contracts, Buchalter. And soon, Murder Incorporated killers were being sent all over the country as hitmen. His most significant murder was the murder of Dutch Schultz, came from Murder Incorporated. By 1935, New York police estimated they had 250 men working for them. And they were grossing over $1 million a year, about $19 million in today's money. In 1936, they acted on Buchalter's orders and gunned down a man named Joe Rosen, a Brooklyn candy store owner. He was a former garment industry trucker, whose union Buchalter had taken over. Rosen had angered Buchalter by refusing to leave town as he was ordered. Fearing that Rosen would cooperate with Thomas Dewey and the feds, Buchalter had him rubbed out. A year later, Buchalter and Gura Shapiro are convicted of violating federal antitrust laws in the rabbit skin fur industry in New York. And while they were out on bail, Buchalter and Shapiro disappeared. And in the winter of 1938, Louis Lepke Buchalter and Gura Shapiro entered my life. My grandfather was Sol Goodman. This is my mother's father. Sol himself, as a young man, had been a bootlegger, gambler, and eventually focused on gambling and the numbers. That's my grandmother next to him, Lottie. And so they had a number of operations and rackets. And the way my grandfather operated at the corner in Baltimore of North and Druid Hill Avenue, he had a confectionery store. That's my mom and my grandmother in front of the confectionery store. And it was a confectionery store. You had a soda fountain downstairs. You'd pull seltzer. They had a chopped ice machine. They would make Baltimore snowballs with the flavoring. They had codfish cakes, coddies, as we called them in Baltimore, and some other snacks, over-the-counter medicines, magazines, all the stuff you have, in a drugstore, not unlike small-scale Walgreens or Rexall, as they were called back then. Anyhow, but what was unique is the first floor was the soda fountain with the magazine rack, etc. This is pretty typical. This is not authentic. In the middle floor, my family lived, my grandfather, grandmother, mom, and my aunt Ronnie. And on the top floor, they had a bookmaking parlor right over where the family lived. And my mother said it was like they had teller cages where you'd walk up and you'd place your bet. They had a teletype, a dedicated teletype, that would get the races from around the country. So they would put up the race results on the chalkboards behind the counters. My mom's claims she learned to read by reading off the teletypes and announcing the race results in the bookmaking parlor. I can imagine it now. And in the fifth at Hialeah, it's Lightning Bolt by 3 lengths. And this is how she tells the story. So anyhow, it was an interesting business for my grandfather. So here's a picture of Gura. So this is cousin Gura. We called him Norman. They have here Jacob. I think we're right. We would know our cousin's name. Anyhow, he was a character. So one night, winter 1938, Gura calls my grandmother. Says, Lottie, I'm coming to Miami. We're driving down from New York. Could we stop over for dinner? We're staying at the Lord Baltimore Hotel. Frankly, I keep kosher. He still kept kosher, Gura. He said, can I come, for dinner? And he said, I'm going to bring a friend with me. I said, sure. Guy shows up, Gura, driving a Lincoln. They were dressed to the nines. The man with Gura wore gray kid gloves, Stetson hat, fedora Stetson. Felt he was dressed really top-end clothes, like, from Saks. In fact, he brought my grandmother a hat from Saks Fifth Avenue. He brought dolls for my mother and for my aunt. So they had dinner. Now, back in those days, you dressed up your water at dinner, you had seltzer. Seltzer bottles went empty. My grandfather says, I'll go downstairs, I'll fill the seltzer bottles from the soda fountain. Goes down, and the whole time he says to me, I knew this guy. He says, I couldn't place his face, but I knew this guy. Goes downstairs to fill the seltzer bottles. He walks past the magazine rack, and there on the cover of the Police Gazette is the guy upstairs having dinner, Louis Lepke Buchalter. My grandfather says he stained his pants. He was so frightened. Here's this man who's responsible for hundreds of murders upstairs with his wife and children. But they finished dinner, they left peacefully. So that was the connection between Lepke and my family that one night in 1938. Eventually, Lepke is arrested. On April 14 of that same year, 1938, Gura was arrested in November. Buchalter stays out free until August of 1939. He surrendered to J. Edgar Hoover around the corner from the Waldorf Astoria Hotel. The surrender was actually negotiated, according to legend, by none other than the columnist and radio broadcaster Walter Winchell, who arranged for Lepke to give himself up to Hoover, because he said, I would only give himself up to Hoover. He wasn't giving himself up to local police. So he was indicted on murder charges for killing the contract killing of that candy store owner, Joey Rosen. And he was arraigned for that and three other murders. On December 2nd, 1941, he was sentenced to death along with his lieutenants, Mendy Weiss and Louis Capone. And Buchalter's lawyers immediately filed an appeal, went as far as the Supreme Court, who affirmed the sentence by a vote of 7-0 with 2 abstentions. And actually, I was said to date, but it's got to just be till recently because there has been another now. He was the only mob boss ever to be executed. So a little more about my own family's background and a little bit of history. There's some funny stories here. I'm going to share them with you to wrap up. So my grandfather, about the time that they had the candy store and the bookmaking parlor upstairs, the soda shop, realized that, and his partners, they realized that during the summer, business got really slow because some of their best customers, their biggest bettors, were spending the summers down at the shore. They were in Ocean City, Atlantic City. And so my grandfather and associates decide they're gonna put in a bookmaking parlor down in Ocean City, Maryland. So they paid money to have a dedicated telegraph line run to the Avondale Hotel. And there in room 314, they would take bets and they would get live race results. And people would come and go, and they had runners go out and find their clients. And basically, it was an all-day kind of, what do you want to bet in the fifth at Aqueduct? Okay, and they'd run back and bring them the betting slip. They opened up. Next morning, in comes the local sheriff, and they paid the local sheriff. He said, "We didn't realize y'all were Jew boys. We don't let Jew boys operate down here in Worcester County. Got till midnight to get out of town." So they packed up, and that was the end of the Ocean City thing. But my grandfather and his partners were persistent, if nothing else. So in 1941, they opened Bay Shore Casino on the Chesapeake Bay. It was on a little island just off the shore of Anne Arundel County, Maryland, not far from Annapolis. And they paid the local county executive a big bribe to get the State Roads Commission to build them a little bridge, a little causeway that ran from the mainland over to the casino. For this, my grandfather said, we put a substantial sum in the poor box. They built this lovely casino. And in the casino, you could have roulette. Slot machines were legal in Maryland back then. But they also had roulette and poker. My grandmother says my grandmother ran it really heavy with her girlfriends. I mean, they played for fun, but she was a poker shark. She taught me how to play poker as a kid. She was good, better than I ever was. Anyhow, and will be. Anyhow, so they opened up in the summer of 1941. Opening weekend, Memorial Day weekend, Jack Benny is the headliner. A smash. Place was sold out. Couldn't get near it. My grandfather says, oh, we're going to make some serious money here. The gaming tables were hot. The next week, it rained. And I don't mean rain. It poured rain. The next week, the act was supposed to be Soapy Tucker. Nobody came. The bridge got washed out. They rebuilt a temporary bridge. You had to park on the mainland and walk half a mile over. And it rained the next week, and the next week, and the next week. And that was the history of the summer. They figured, all right, better luck next year. We'll run this again. For next summer, we'll bring in the big name entertainment. But of course, December 7, 1941, the United States enters World War II, gas rationing, blackouts. And Bay Ridge Treasure Island was no more. So my grandfather took what money he had left and he invests in a theater on the Baltimore block known as the Clover Theater. Down in the basement, they had another club called the 2 o'clock Club. And at 2 o'clock, they had entertainment. They had, of course, strippers. Upstairs, the burlesque dancers kept their clothes on, kind of. Striptease, but not all the way. Downstairs, anything went. And of course, liquor laws being what they were in Baltimore, that was illegal, but you pay the right people, you can do the right thing. So my grandfather made a pretty good buck. In 1952, a young girl from West Virginia comes looking for a job. My grandfather looks at her and realizes she's not 18. He says, I can put you up in the Clover, you can dance there. What's your name? My name is Belle Cartwright. He says, that's a terrible name for a dancer. You're gonna be a big star someday. Yeah, I'm a big star. Okay, we're gonna call you Star. Then he says, we're gonna call you Blaze Star. My grandfather gave the first job to the very famous stripper, Blaze Star. We grew up with Blaze. Blaze was a friend. Blaze had a really nice house with the first person I ever knew had a swimming pool in her backyard. So we used to go over her house and go swimming with her nephew, Johnny. So, and that was the story of Blaze, who, if you ever see the movie Blaze with Paul Newman and Lolita Davidovich, if you haven't seen it, Paul Newman plays Earl Long because, of course, Blaze got involved with Earl Long, the brother of Huey Long, who was governor of Louisiana, crazy as a bedbug, Earl Long. And Paul Newman does a pretty good job. The movie kind of peters out. That's why I think it wasn't a big hit. It was one of those movies that was interesting for the first half, and then you couldn't wait for it to end. At least that was my story. So, but that's the story of my grandfather at 2 o'clock. Here he is with Blaze and her sister Dolores at the door of the club. And that's the sign that's still there today on the Baltimore block for the 2 o'clock club. When I was a kid, we used when my parents would go away, of course, we would stay with my grandmother. My father's mother really didn't like us kids underfoot, but we'd always stay with my mother's mom and dad. So my grandfather used to go down to the club about midday, do whatever he had to do down there. He'd come home about 3 in the afternoon. He would take a nap, he'd get up, he'd have dinner, and then he'd go back to the club. But some days, for whatever reason, he didn't come home to take his nap and take dinner. So my grandmother would have to take him dinner. And so we'd pile the kids in the car, we'll go down to the club. So they let us come in. We're not going to leave us in a car in the middle of the Baltimore block. It was not exactly safe. So we had to go into the club. Carl, the doorman, would look after us. And he would let us both behind, my sisters Debbie and I, behind the bar where we'd play with the pulls on the soda fountains and the seltzer thing and drink a lot of Shirley Temples until my grandfather would say, it's time for you guys to get out of here and go home. One night, I snuck into the club. The front bar was separated from the main club. And I kind of sat like this in a booth in the back. So and out comes this stripper and she starts her routine and she looks at me and she goes, little boy, you can't be in here. My grandmother was in that room like a bat out of hell, grabs me by the ear, drags me out of the room. They never let me back in again until I was of age. Whenever my pop, I was old enough at that point that soon thereafter my grandmother said, all right, I'm taking Papa's dinner. You stay home. Your sister's coming with me. So that's my Jewish mafia story, friends. I hope you had fun. I hope you learned some things you never knew before about Jews and organized crime. And thank goodness, I think we're not so involved anymore, at least not in the illegitimate parts of criminal enterprise. So I hope to see you all tomorrow at the annual meeting. I hope to see you all this Friday at Shabbat. We're coming near the end of the season, right? I mean, it's only a few more weeks of Shabbos and presentations and meetings. We have a very busy April. We have the League of Women Voters discussion coming up with myself, John Danner, and Jane Picker on separation of church and state. We have the interfaith
Sunday.
program on Sunday, which is made possible by the Rosner Foundation. It's our shared scholar series this year, and I and other clergy will be discussing how our faith has been impacted or how our faith impacted our response to the hurricane. And then, of course, on the 22nd, we have the BJC Seder. If you haven't signed up yet, please do. And help. Sorry, Bat Yam Seder. That slips out because they both start with B. And yeah, I've been talking for 90 minutes. I'm tired. Okay, all right. Yes, the Bat Yam Seder. So I hope you had a good time. Thank you very much. And thank you on Zoom. Yep.